So this is my maybe third WineConf. I last met you all at The Hague. I think my colleague and our executive director, Karen Sandler, was at the conference in Toronto, and I guess there hasn't been one since then. So sadly, but it's an interesting experience for me because I have a feeling I go to a lot of open source and free software events, but this is the first one I've been to since the pandemic started. So I'm probably going to remember this conference forever in great detail because it was the first one. Just like I remember the last one, I was at the Southern California Linux Expo, literally the day the first COVID case was reported in the US. So I'm really excited to be here with you all, but I have a relatively serious and ominous topic to talk about. And I really appreciate you all inviting me talk about licensing, which is, I know, probably what most of you don't want to hear about or would rather not talk about. But I think I'm really happy and excited to talk to you about it because I really want to say something that I probably should have said a long time ago. Thank you for picking the LGPL as wine's license. Early this morning, I got up and I decided to read the email threads about the vote in 2002 about the LGPL, which I had never read before, but I found the archives of Wine Devel, and I was not surprised to find the typical arguments that people have about choosing a copyleft and a non-copyleft license. What was really interesting, and I think that conversation is an interesting historical archive, because it is the only time that I've seen a project that existed for that long under a non-copyleft license actually discuss and democratically, as a community, vote to switch to a copyleft license. I did read the wine history page on this, and the link to the Rewind project is dead, as it turns out. So apparently the fork that they were going to make of wine under the BSD license never came to fruition. And the canonical version is indeed the LGPL version. When you read over that discussion, you find that most of the discussion is about the question of what happens with upstream and who has control and develops upstream. And there's a lot of arguments about what is Codeweavers going to do. I know that Jeremy spent a lot of time talking about the LGPL as a license to keep his own business honest, which I think you were honest anyway, but it has served that purpose well. And I think it served the purpose of dealing with the various vendors long since gone that were circling around the project at the time. But one of the things, after being a copyleft theorist for a very long time, is that I've finally figured out in recent years that a copyleft license is actually not about the developers. The developers make the decision to pick a license, and if they pick a copyleft one, they're the ones that have made that decision. But the goal of the license is really to protect the downstream users and their rights. So I'm going to talk about that some today. First, I want to explain, most of you probably heard this 2 years ago, but so it's a refresher. So the Software Freedom Conservancy, where I work and I helped found, is a nonprofit charity where under the IRS designation of 501c3, which means we're a charity. We can't be controlled by companies like a trade association would be. And our mission, which when you found a nonprofit charity, you file this document with the IRS that proves you're doing something that's for the public good and therefore don't have to pay taxes and your donors get a tax deduction in the US. So our mission is to preserve, protect, promote, improve open source and free software generally for the general public. We do these days more advocacy and policy work than we used to. We were originally founded to be primarily a home to open source and free software projects, which I'm going to get into in a minute about how that happened for wine. But we found that the need for folks to talk about the non-commercial and consumer-based aspects of open source and free software is very much needed today because so much of open source is very corporate now. And so we're kind of the non-corporate, non-commercial organization talking and promoting open source and free software. And as part of that work, we have done probably the most amount of copyleft enforcement in the United States, and probably second in the world behind GPLviolations.org, which was organized by Harold Velta in the early 2000s as far as worldwide enforcement. And eventually we'll probably surpass Harold because he doesn't do it anymore. So many of you in this room have heard this story. I told this story when WineConf was at FOSDEM, and I think I might have told it at The Hague, but I'm going to tell it again because it's a community story that I think is really, really valuable. So in 2002, at some event, do you remember what event it was, Jeremy? I still don't either. But Jeremy and I were both at some event, and I set up this meeting, and at the time, I worked for an organization called the Free Software Foundation. I'm one of the few people in the world who had Richard Stallman as a boss. I don't recommend that. But at the time, my boss was Richard Stallman, and he sent me to this conference, and he said, convince this Jeremy White guy to make wine part of the GNU project. So I go to this dinner with Jeremy, and I pitch. I'm a good employee, I like having more control of my destiny at Software Freedom Conservancy, but when somebody hires me to do a job, I usually try to do it. And so I tried to convince Jeremy, and Jeremy said to me, look, I like so many things about being part of a nonprofit. Wine needs it. I don't want code weavers to control the wine project. I want it to be in an organization. But Stallman has this list of things that he makes a project do. And Jeremy kind of went through the list. I won't tell you which ones he objected to and which ones he didn't. But there was a long list because Stallman. And Jeremy had 2 or 3 things on the list. And he's like, the wine project's never going to do these things. But we really want to be in a nonprofit. I want a counterbalance to code weavers. I want there to be a community organization. And no deal, basically. Wine did not join the GNU project. So 5 or 6 years later, we're founding this organization, Software Freedom Conservancy. And I remember the last thing Jeremy said to me at that dinner. He said, why can't there just be an organization that's there for open source and free software projects that doesn't have a complex list of basically what rules about what words you can say or can't say in the project? And so I had filed that away, and we found this organization called Software Freedom Conservancy. And initially, our first member was the Samba project. And I remembered my conversation with Jeremy. So we emailed Jeremy and said, hey, the thing that we were talking about way back in 2002, here in 2007, it exists now. Would Wine like to join? And so Wine joined the Conservancy as our second member project. And it was kind of interesting because our first 2 projects were these 2 projects that were basically taking on Microsoft at the height of Microsoft's anti-open source efforts. Now Microsoft has rewritten that history, but I remember it really well. I remember being called un-American, spreading a cancer. It was like McCarthyist, right? It was like this idea that, like, if you have these copyleft licensing, they're going to destroy the software industry. And so I have a long memory, and my colleague Karen Sandler actually gave a speech at Microsoft, and I convinced her. I said, when you give your speech, ask them to apologize for calling the GPL un-American, a cancer, and eating up all software like a Pac-Man. She asked for it in his talk, and according to her, half the room gasped that she would dare to ask Microsoft for an apology for something they had done. So I'm still aware. I think Wine is incredibly interesting as a free software project because it was designed effectively to make proprietary software work on a free software operating system. And I'm not so much of a zealot that I think that that's a bad thing. I think it's a really good thing. I think what Wine, in approaching this problem, did was it acknowledged that people wanted to move from a proprietary world to a free software world, but they couldn't do it all at once. And they had these applications that they were used to, that they needed. And there's a lot of them out there. And there was a need to create something that made it easy for people to come over. Now, the switch to the copyleft license, I think, was one of the smartest decisions the project made. I really believe that if wine had stayed under the BSD license, eventually a company would have come along and built a fully proprietary wine-based product. And that is the company that Microsoft would have chosen to sue, because they would have had no moral high ground. The LGPL gives wine this moral high ground of, hey, we're an open source project. Does Microsoft really want to sue an open source project? And while the threat from our first two member projects at SFC, Samba and Wine, the threat for Samba is basically gone. They love Samba now. They're like, hey, like, people still want to use our file system on Linux? Yes, please, more Samba. And with Wine, not so much. So there's this thing called the Open Invention Network, and there's this guy who runs it named Keith Brigelt, and he walks around these Linux events telling people about how the ecosystem is so safe now for Linux because there's cross-patent licensing for all of Linux, and there's a huge patent non-aggression pact. When OIM was getting started, I went to Keith Brigelt with a list of all of SFC's projects and said, they're all Linux-based projects. They should all be part of your Linux system definition. So I sent him the list of all our projects, and a couple months later, an update to the Linux system definition comes out, and every single project from SFC was in that list, except for one, yours. And the next time I saw Keith Brigelt, I said, hey, you forgot one. And he looked at me and said, which one? I said, Wine. And he laughed. Because there was no chance, this is before Microsoft was an OAN licensee, but there was no chance that anybody was going to agree to a patent non-aggression pact with regard to the Windows API. Now, I don't think there's really a lot of, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, like I can't tell you legal risk for anything, but I think as a political matter, the chance of real patent risk for Wine is near zero, because it's politically unviable for Microsoft to come after Wine over patents. And I think the reason it's politically unviable is because Wine is licensed under the LGPL. So I think this is one of the best decisions that the project made for its future and its life. Now, the LGPL also has other requirements other than the patent-related stuff. There are important requirements. And I think it may be the case that Wine's license has, until recently, never been violated. So I'm going to ask, other than hearing it from me recently, or somebody at SFC recently, can you raise your hand if you're aware of any time in history the LGPL being violated on Wine? No, I had this on my slide because I was sure that nobody was going to raise their hand. We should talk later about what it was. Okay. All right. Well, there's apparently, I'm not going to put it on the recording because I generally don't like to put the details of GPL violations, but apparently there was one, right? But it's pretty rare. I think now things are starting to change. If you look at the history of kind of violations of GPL, violations of copyleft licenses on other projects, the GPL starts getting used in the late 80s. 89 is the first instance of the GPL. The early GNU projects were licensed under the GPL. And those were not really, there was this Objective-C thing that Steve Jobs did. But if you put that aside, which was kind of a one-off, and it's Steve Jobs, so it's a special case, I think, there weren't really violations on the early GNU projects until the mid-1990s. For Linux, there weren't violations really until the early 2000s is when you started to see people violating the GPL on Linux. And I think it has to do with adoption. Once a project reaches a certain level of popularity, of interest in the industry, that's the moment when you start to see the copyleft license being violated, not just because of a mistake, but because of a business decision to ignore the terms of the license. So I guess I should congratulate Wine because people are violating your license now. So should we celebrate that? I didn't expect that to actually get applause. I mean, I want a world where everyone just shares their software freely because they want to. But I'm a realist, and I realize that most people don't want to share their software with each other. And so violations are inevitable in a situation where folks are adopting software and seeing what they can get away with, because it's a world we live in where companies try to see what they can get away with. So the reason, there's a kind of a detailed argument of why I think this is happening now. I left a lot of time for kind of interactive at the end here, so we can kind of talk about whether I'm right about this. But my theory goes like this. Everybody in this room knows that Windows applications remain completely ubiquitous. I think the long tail of Windows applications mattering is a lot, like people in this room get it, but outside of this room, the industry doesn't get the fact that there are lots and lots and lots of Windows applications that people still want to work out there in the world. And people who develop new technology, who sit in Silicon Valley and fund, VCs who fund new companies, they don't think about the fact that there's this long tail in this industry. It's still the case that there were IBM mainframes well into current time. People still write COBOL code these days, right? Things in technology have a much longer tail than other folks want to admit. And the recent change, though, is the default deployment environment for software over the last 15 years has been changing dramatically. The age of desktop computing is some sense, it's not coming to an end, but it's becoming less the primary way that people consume software. And Linux is a great example of this, where Linux was effectively a server and a desktop operating system, not an embedded system. But now Linux, I would argue, because it's copylefted, because it's under the GPL, is by far the most popular embedded operating system in the world today. Every Android mobile device is a Linux device. That's something we never would have imagined when Linux was getting started in the 90s. The other thing we wouldn't have imagined, I don't think, is that Windows application would have a place other than a desktop computer. I don't think we really imagined that people might want to run Windows application on embedded devices, which I think is now starting to happen, which is why we're seeing violations of Wine's license. This is what we've already been through with Linux and BusyBox and other system-level software. Violations were, if you go back to one of my talks from, say, 2006, 7-ish timeframe, it's all about like, oh, when somebody violates a copyleft license, it's always a misunderstanding, and you just educate somebody and they correct the problem and everything's fine. The embedded industry was different. The embedded industry knew about copyleft. They wanted to adopt Linux. They didn't have a tremendous amount of interest in what happened to their users with regard to Linux. And frankly, the widespread non-compliance with copyleft licenses in the Linux space was engineered and planned. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't we didn't understand the license. Embedded manufacturers understood the GPL very well. They decided that basically me and Howard Velto weren't enough to stop them and decided to just ignore the license. Well, specifically ignore some really key areas of the license, which has made the situation much worse. So one of the things to think about copyleft licenses, and this is really, really, I think, hard for folks who are developers, it's not all about you, I'm sorry to say. Copyleft licenses are this weird policy system, which is under the control and power of developers. But the beneficiary is really the end user, the consumer of the software, not the developer. And there's kind of a circular pattern to this, right? Because if you look at where new developers to open source projects come from, particularly like system level open source projects like Linux, what happens is, and this happened to most of us in the 90s, those of us who are old enough to remember the 90s, you got Linux, right? And you were like, hey, this is really cool. Let me do something with it. And you'd have to make changes to get it to work on your computer because it didn't work on anything very well at the time. And so you'd make some changes, and if they were good enough to actually be useful to somebody else, you posted a patch to a news group or a mailing list, and then suddenly you went from being a user to being a developer. And that line used to be very fluid because most people using software then were technically inclined. Now, most people using software today are not necessarily technically inclined, but the right and the freedom to tinker remains really important. It's where we get the next generation of developers from. I always worry about the fact that almost every television in the world is running Linux these days, but almost none of them, in fact, kind of none of them, actually give you the source code such that you can actually tinker with that television, because now televisions aren't really televisions. They're a computer, embedded computer, connected to a very large display. And they should work like computers, but they don't. And this is because the embedded industry made a plan that they wouldn't work like regular computers. And it turns out that's in violation of the license. Now, GPL v2 comes down to these few words. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being deposed about these words in GPL v2, the scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. And I will be asked probably hundreds by the time I'm dead, questions by lawyers about what it means to have the scripts used to install the executable. Install is where the ballgame is. And the reason why is because on a desktop computer, no one ever questioned the idea about whether you could reinstall your software. Imagine buying a desktop computer in the 1990s and being told, you can't reinstall the operating system. You're just not allowed to reinstall it. Like, no one would have accepted that as a reasonable position. What's happened is the embedded industry, because they treat them more like appliances than computers, have been able to convince the entire consumer base that that's not a right that they ought to have. But the GPL thought of this ahead of time and said, yes, you're supposed to be allowed to install. And I think it's true for Wine as much as it's true for Linux or BusyBox or any other system software. If someone has a copy of Wine on their system running some Windows binary, we all agree that Windows binary is proprietary. That's allowed because Wine's under the LGPL. I'm going to get more into that later. But Wine itself, I would expect, and if you want to object to this later when I'm in Q&A, you can, but I would expect most people in this room would say, yes, if I have a patch to Wine that I've done myself, and I want to upgrade Wine on my own computer with my patch, I should be allowed to do that. And the license ought to protect my right to do that. In fact, the license does protect your right to do that. In fact, this is something I've just recently discovered because I've been spending, turns out there's a project under the LGPL that's had violations recently called Wine. And I've had occasion to dig more into the LGPL than I ever have in my career. I've focused mostly on the main GPL. I've discovered that actually the LGPL is even better in this regard as far as really making it clear that you have a right to reinstall. You only have basically two options. There's some details there, but at top level, you have two options. If you have a work that uses the library, and for purposes of this definition, Wine is the library. I realize it's not technically a library, but it's in a computer geek kind of sense. But in terms of the license, it is the library. You have to be able to relink the executable work containing the modified library. That to me says, okay, if I have a proprietary Windows binary and Wine, I have to be able to get back to running my version of Wine with that proprietary Windows binary if I've changed Wine. My other option is I can take the second part of this section of LGPL and say, okay, will it operate properly if I install my modified Wine? And I think actually that dynamic linking section applies the most because I think if lawyers look at this, they will see running Wine with a proprietary application is kind of like a dynamic link. And it probably kind of is a dynamic link, at least and if you try to take the technical stuff and distill it to a legal conclusion. So the LGPL is really clear about this, that you're supposed to be able to install a modified version of Wine if you want to install a modified version onto your device. So this is the violation narrative. This is not hypothetical. I'm not going to say names of companies on the mic and on the stream. We can talk about it in the hallway track of who is doing this. But imagine, if you will, not hypothetically, that an embedded system maker using x86 for an embedded system develop some specialized software for their products as Windows binaries. And they decide that they're sick of using Windows because, like, I don't have to tell this room, everybody's sick of using Windows. And they say, well, gee, there's this Linux thing, it runs a lot better. And there's this Wine thing, so we don't have to re-engineer all this specialized software we wrote for Windows. We can run Linux, we can run Wine, we can put it in our embedded system. And look at this, there's an entire trade-associated industry that will show us how to lock down the devices so that no consumers can do anything they want. They can't upgrade their software anymore. And we've got complete vendor lock-in. And Wine goes right along with Linux and BusyBox and everything else. So what we see is not just a violation on Wine, we see a violation on the whole stack. But now suddenly, because there is this application user space software originally written for Windows, and this desire to move to a Linux-based embedded system instead of a Windows-based embedded system, for all the reasons that are obvious to everyone, we now see these violations happening on Wine. So I want to really drive the point home before I just turn it over to discussion about why this point about it not being about the developers, right? So one of the things we think is like, well, we got copyleft licenses, right, so we can get patches upstream. That is one reason to license under a copyleft license. I don't think it's the most important reason to do so. So years ago, we filed these lawsuits filed against 14 defendants over BusyBox violations. You can see, if you read that case, that Samsung was one of the defendants in that case, even though Samsung had upstream patches. In fact, they had developers on staff whose job was to work upstream in Linux, yet Samsung products were in the marketplace violating the license. At these large companies, those two teams generally have nothing to do with each other. The folks that they hire to work upstream don't even know what products, most of the time, that company is putting Linux or BusyBox or anything else into. So you get this weird bifurcation where the community might be happily collaborating upstream with somebody who works for this company, even while that company is flagrantly violating the license. And based on 20-some years of experience now, those engineers have absolutely no power to fix the problem. They're aghast, like, to hear that their company's violating the GPL, but when they raise it with their manager and their manager's manager, they say, that's not your department. Don't worry about it. It gets so bad that I walk around conferences sometimes and people walk by me and hand me slips of paper that have a list of product numbers on it. Because it's a bunch of products at their company that are violating the GPL, that they know are violating the GPL, that they themselves, even though they're an upstream developer for the project that's being violated, can do almost nothing about. Which, by the way, relates to the fact that they often don't hold their own copyrights. Their company holds their copyrights. Their company doesn't really much care for the GPL. So they, as developers, are basically powerless to do enforcement. I'm sure that when you all picked LGPL as your license, you were thinking about Jeremy and CodeWeavers. You were thinking about the various other companies that weren't friendly like CodeWeavers is, that might proprietarize Wine. And you were worried about getting patches upstream, being able to keep doing your work. And it was a license chosen to keep those companies honest. And it has served that purpose very well. But I think now is the moment in the history of Wine where you have to think about what the LGPL does for your downstream users, the ones you're never going to meet probably, who end up with Wine embedded in a larger product that they don't have the source code to, and they don't have the same rights you do to just make a patch for Wine and reinstall it. So I hate to come to developers and say, it's your job to help me uphold these rights. You don't have to do all the work. SFC is here to help you do this kind of work. But it is a moment that I think the community has to think about this question. The reason why is typically GPL enforcement is done through copyright. This was the original idea behind copyleft, that you would take a copyrighted work, put it under terms under a copyright license, and then use that license as a copyright holder to enforce, to uphold these rights. Now, we've been working pretty hard to come up with alternative methods to do this. because we realized the developers already did their job, right? You picked the LGPL, you wrote a bunch of great code under the LGPL. To come back and ask again, okay, now you've got to help us enforce the GPL, right? And it's a big ask for developers. So we really believe that there should be an end user path through a thing called a legal theory called third-party beneficiary. And we're pursuing that in our case against Vizio, sfconservancy.org/Vizio. You can read all about that case. Nevertheless, I think probably, given that GPL or LGPL enforcement in this case is new to the wine community, relatively speaking, I think probably taking a kind of a copyright approach to get started is the right way to go, just because that's the traditional approach. So that's really what I'd like to talk to you about. So the way we do enforcement at SFC, years ago we wrote these things called the principles of community-oriented GPL enforcement. And those are just basically laying out the rules for what we're going to do with regard to enforcing the GPL. There's a lot of FUD out there about this idea that there could be copyright trolls and people using GPL enforcement to get rich. So one of our key principles at the most basic level is to say this is not a for-profit endeavor. The primary goal is not to get money out of these companies, it's to get them to comply with the license. And you'll notice in our Vizio case, in fact, everybody's really confused because our complaint, we drafted it and it looks like we forgot to ask for money. In fact, we drafted it so that they have no way to resolve the case by giving us money. They have to give us the source code to all the software that's in the Vizio devices, which wine is not present to my knowledge in that particular case. But that's kind of our approach, and our focus is to get the right software and source code and freedom to install to the users, not to profit from doing enforcement. The other thing, the key thing, and you can read the whole principles document, and I encourage you to do so, but the other key part of the principles that we are very clear about is to really work with a company first as best we can to convince them to comply because it's the right thing to do. And I wouldn't have proposed this talk if that process were working for wine. It is not, which is why I'm here talking to you about enforcement of the LGPL. So I've got some time. Actually, I never started my timer, so I'm not sure how much time I have left. But at least about 20 minutes, right? Yeah. So this is just a couple of possible discussion topics. I really just want to turn it over to you to ask questions. I realize that having talk about license enforcement is a surprising thing to have to do at a conference where we're going to be talking about code. And I really appreciate you all inviting me to come here and speak about this, but I really want to hear from you and hear your questions, right? Because I've spent so much of my time over the last basically 25 years doing GPL enforcement, worrying about license compliance and so forth, that I don't want to make any assumptions that you've read the too many things that SFC or I have written on this topic. So what I'd like to do is just open up the floor to these discussion topics that are on the slide, or really anything else you want to ask about, what does it mean to enforce wine's license, and what would happen if we do, and all of those kinds of issues. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over, start throwing some hands up.
If I could make just a quick statement on this?
Yes, please do, Jeremy. Let me give you the mic.
So
At least I gotta give you that one.
sure. Okay. So for the stream's benefit, it's very important from a code weaver's perspective that we're now finally successful. We've made it, right? We definitely don't want to create a chill in the world. We don't want our customers to think that wine is risky. We don't want them to feel that there's so this is very dangerous for us from a code weaver's perspective. And Bradley and SSC has been very conscious and gracious about that. So I wanted to thank you for that. But the description of this that kind of felt compelling to me is that BusyBox has sort of been alone. Like they're fighting the fight for everybody else. Like they're the guys who get dragged into the lawsuits again and again and again. And so then the question is, do we want to let them keep fighting alone, or is there some will to help them? I think that was something that Bradley said to me that's resonated. So that was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat it for the stream once you ask.
Yeah. So when the companies don't change wine at all and use it in their product, that's still a violation? Because when I read that clause, I think the intention, at least how it sounds to me, is that the worry is that people will change the code in some weird way, change the build system, and won't give the instructions on how to rebuild it. But here, if they're using normal wine, is that still a violation?
So the question is, if they don't modify wine, is it a violation or not, is really the question. And is it possible to use an unmodified wine? So it's a complicated question, right? Because for a couple of reasons. One is that, as it turns out, as a copyright matter, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I spent way too much time in my life around lawyers. As a copyright matter, so the lawyers tell me, making a binary is a form of modification, right? So the source code is the work under copyright. And then when you compile it, you transform, this is actually a word that appears in the copyright statute in the US, you transform the work into something else, i.e. a binary. So you need to comply with the LGPL when you make that transformation. So then the question is when they made that transformation, and maybe they just downloaded the binary from WineHQ, right, and just put it on the device, but they could still, I'm not saying that they necessarily violate the GPL the LGPL when they do that. The question is, when they put it into a device, do they make it possible for you to install a modified version? So for example, if the binary came from WineHQ and WineHQ's updated their binary, and now I've got this third-party device, it's got wine in it, but I really want to use the new version from WineHQ. I know that upstream, or my upstream, which is this company in the middle here, they use the binary straight off WineHQ. Okay, so they didn't recompile it, but if they didn't give me the ability to reinstall wine with the new version, getting it from the same place they got it from, after all, then that likely would be a violation. Details matter. So I never want to say some constructed hypothetical where we've only made up half the facts for it is a violation or not. But that's the goal of the license, is the ability to rebuild and reinstall the binary. And the reinstall part is really important. Yeah, go ahead.
Their efforts to make this difficult to modify, is that a violation?
So the question is, does every Android phone, I'm going to overstate your question, by the way. Does every Android phone on the market violate the GPL? I think the answer is, quite frankly, probably, in my view. It's very interesting because Google phones are a really good example of compliance, right? At least the last one I looked at was an earlier Pixel. But Google has always done this thing where you can basically unlock the firmware, and you can install an alternate firmware, and you have to agree to all these terms that you won't do this, won't do like basically that you won't mess up their network and all this other stuff, and that you can't go back to the vendor and your warranty is canceled and all this sort of stuff. And some phones do offer you that. You can go in there and do that. And a good example is if you look at like the alternative firmware projects like Lineage OS. If you can install Lineage OS on the device, chances are they probably weren't violating the GPL, because the fact that you could install an alternative firmware is speaking to the fact that they probably didn't violate the license. You don't know for sure until you look at the details, of course, but it speaks to that idea. I certainly think that the devices where they've been unable to put a modified firmware onto, I suspect it is violating Linux's license. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I mean, you don't necessarily have to agree with me. I just want to make sure I answered you. But like I said, this is going to be a debate, right? We're going to be enforcing on the GPL for years to come, and the other side is going to say that's not what install means. They're already saying that. You can find articles that misquote me to argue that install does not mean install. I think install means install. You go ahead. Yes, please.
Software is so ubiquitous, and as you mentioned, developers in general, even basically benefited from systems they have with to learn how to use technology, and it's only become more important since we all have that experience.
Yep. Yeah, I appreciate the point. So I just to re-summarize your point for the stream. Yeah, the point that you made was, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I say what your name is on the stream? John Brooks is making the point that the freedom to tinker is something that brought at least the older people in this room to this open source and free software thing. Or the ability to do things with your devices was really important. And there's this change in the industry that is not getting to all the users anymore. And so it's not creating that, which I really agree with. Am I summarizing your point right? Okay. I tried the best for the stream. Yeah. Can we pass the mic around for the stream? Is that like doable? Sort of. Well, if folks want to come up.
So a long time ago, there was this wine version called WineX, and also related to that, CDGA. Was that in violation of the wine license? Because that stopped being a thing like after a few years. I seem to remember that it was kind of possible to build WineX, although it was really complicated. I don't remember like all the details, that was so long ago, but would it be like possible to have like a similar product like today, like appear like some kind of proprietary wine? Like was it like in violation of something, or was it like totally fine?
So I don't know the facts of WineX to state with. I think we could sit down later and we could look historically and see what they were doing and whether it was a violation. WineX was forked from the BSD code. So Jeremy's just pointed out. So because it was forked from the BSD code, it wouldn't have been a violation of the LGPL because no changes from the LGPL version presumably appeared in it. But another thing I want to point out, that even if it had been based on the LGPL software, one of the ways you can address a violation of the GPL is to just stop. And so if they're no longer in business and they're not doing it anymore, there's kind of no remedy if somebody says, I'm just going to stop distributing wine forever and I don't want to deal with this anymore. That's always an option, right? To just say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I think everybody in the GPL enforcement community has always considered that a reasonable remedy to say, just stop. It's not the ideal remedy. We'd rather they actually complied with the license, but ceasing to use the copylefted product in your own product is always an option. Yeah. Do folks want to? Because I think it's going to save time for the stream. If folks want to come up here, is that okay? As a organization? Yeah. Why don't we do it that way? Yes, sir. Just so it'll take twice as long to repeat these questions for the stream.
Right. Yes. So right now or at least a year ago, there was a complication with other wine adjacent projects using wine headers, for example, for like Microsoft APIs. And the problem was they were under non-copyleft licenses, which complicated it because they had to rewrite the headers again in order to avoid going against the LGPL. Does your organization have an opinion on making the project LGPL, but putting the headers under a more open license?
I'd argue with the question of whether a non-copyleft license is more open, but with that proviso, I think these are difficult decisions for projects, right? And I think that looking at your ecosystem and making those kinds of decisions about what's the best decision for a project is the best way to do it. There's also the issue that something that's truly not copyrightable, like for example, in the United States, not a lawyer, but this is what lawyers tell me, facts are not copyrightable. So for example, a register layout for a CPU is not, in anybody's view that I know of, who's reasonable anyway, a copyrightable thing, because there's only one way the registers are laid out. If I make a header file that talks about the layout of the registers and their names, the CPU vendor should not succeed if they try to sue me for copyright infringement, because it's a fact. It's like copywriting the phone book, because there's only one way to say it, right? So a great example I always use is bubble sort, right? If I asked you all to sit down and write bubble sort, we would all generate something really close. I don't think any of our implementations would be copyrightable because they just wouldn't be unique enough to get copyright protection in the United States. So that's another question about headers. Like, was that header really copyrightable in the first place? And I encourage projects to look at that question and say, I think it's probably in Wine's interest to say the exact layout of the Windows API ought not be copyrightable, because APIs should not be copyrightable, right? So you might want to choose a non-copyleft license to signal that we don't think this information should be copyrightable anyway. We don't think it is as a matter for how things should be, and therefore we're going to put this under like CC0, this part, like the header part, under CC0, because we're making a statement about our views about what ought to be copyrightable. Because it is dangerous if courts, I mean, we saw this with the Google v. Oracle case, when courts try to define what an API is, which my view is everybody has in their head what they think an API is, and everybody thinks about it a little bit differently. But if courts try to say, well, APIs as a general matter are copyrightable, there's a lot of danger there for the entire software industry, free software and proprietary software. I mean, if you think about how Linux came to be, right? It was a re-implementation of all the Unix APIs. If the Unix APIs have been copyrightable, could Linux even have been written in the first place? Those kinds of questions are the ones you need to ask about things like headers, I think.
So if we ask the SFC to take assignment of our wine copyrights, could you?
Sorry, they can hear you, but I can't actually.
If we ask the SFC to take assignment of our wine copyrights, can you refresh us on what that means and what are the implications?
I really appreciate the question, because this is a question that I'm going to be wanting to ask a lot of you who hold your own copyrights in wine. The typical way to do GPL enforcement is through a copyright action, which means the copyright holders are the one to take action. If we were to have to litigate, they would normally be the plaintiffs in that litigation. So I think it's a question for all of you. If you want to enforce the LGPL and you want to do it through a copyright matter, which I think is probably recommended for wine right now for the reasons I stated in my talk, then the question is, do you want to be a plaintiff yourself? Which is possible, or do you want SFC to be a plaintiff on your behalf? The only way for SFC effectively to be a plaintiff on your behalf is if you were to assign your copyrights to the SFC. And I've changed my position on copyright assignment multiple times in my career. I think copyright assignment has serious problems, particularly when implemented as a universal requirement for projects. I think that's been clearly shown. I also think that relying on a single organization to hold all the copyrights for a project is dangerous, or even a majority, an overwhelming majority, to have all the copyrights, because that means they have a lot more power to decide whether the license is enforced or not. So I really believe deeply in a highly diversely held copyright base, primarily by individuals. I've been turned off by the idea of companies holding copyrights, which the reason why is that many of the companies that now hold a lot of the copyright in Linux really would prefer Linux not to be GPL'd. So they have kind of this industry pressure now to say, well, we don't really want you to enforce the GPL. And by the way, we're a major copyright holder. And so that's dangerous for the Linux project, I think. So those are the kinds of issues to think through. I should note that one of the things we did was we made copyright assignment easy and self-service. So you can go to our website and assign copyright actually on any project you want to us if you would like to. And it's like a web form. You just read through the legal terms and then agree. I don't recommend doing that without really researching and deciding if that's what you want to do. But one of the reasons I'm here is to talk about those questions, because I think for any developer, I'm actually amazed that developers so often take a job where their company automatically gets copyright. And almost any job you get, especially in the United States, it's what's called a work for hire, and your company holds the copyright automatically. I'm often kind of bemused at developers who will rant at me about like copyright assignment, it's such a horrible thing. And I'm like, where do you work? And like, yeah, I said, did you negotiate an agreement with your employer that you wouldn't assign copyright to them? They go, what do you mean? It's like, well, you signed a standard employment agreement, right? And they're like, yeah. I said, so you assigned all your copyrights to your company. but you're telling me you're against copyright assignment. Which is it? And I think developers, particularly developers on copyleft projects, have to think through this question of like, does my employer hold copyright? Do I hold copyright? Do I want the responsibility of holding copyright? Does my rights of authorship feel like something that I want to hold myself? And do I have an obligation to stand up when the license is violated if I am going to keep those rights? Those are all really complicated questions, and I don't want to presume I know the answers for this community. Mainly, I want to be here as a resource telling you, A, I'm seeing these LGPL violations in the wild, and B, we'd like to take action on enforcement, and C, we need your help and input to make decisions about how to do it and when to do it. Come on.
So I have a related question because I actually was wondering if I'm, for example, a copyright holder in wine and I want to win the plaintiff in such an action, what does that imply for me? I mean, first, I mean, I guess that would require some time on my part, of course. Would that give me some liability? That is, the fact of doing this kind of thing, am I, onboarding some liability? If something goes wrong, can it be reflected on me, on my money, on my whatever? And and I mean, it's not that I'm really considering this thing at this point, but I'm curious about what the answer would be. And also, can I add a second point? Well, actually, it's not something really concrete for me because we were speaking of copyright assignment, and actually I have that in my contract with Codeweaver. So I actually have a couple of patches I got into one before working for Codeweavers, but then I started working for Codeweavers, and I mean, ask Jeremy for that.
So, I mean, my understanding, I'm going to check with Jeremy, that is, I'm going to put you on the spot, I apologize. That's negotiable for your employees, right? Whether. Okay, don't answer. Okay, okay.
To the many staff members, in here who I do hold your copyrights. If you feel strongly that you would like your work to be used in this manner, we can talk. Okay, but generally, Codeweavers does hold a lot of copyright in wine. So, so I'm not opposed to your work being used in this, but I want to have a conversation about it. I want to understand. I want you to understand before that happens.
Right, and that's a. Yeah. Right. Agreed. And I think, I mean, we have this, my colleague Karen Sandler at SFC started this initiative called Contract Patch, which it's really an initiative to educate software developers about the fact that every employment contract is negotiable. And this ought to be on your list when you take a job. In my view, if you work on open source software, when you go in to negotiate with your employer, you should ask the question and have like Jeremy is suggesting, have a conversation with your employer about it. And especially if it's a friendly, gregarious, cool employer like Codeweavers, like they're going to have that conversation with you. And it's a negotiation, right? And the copyrights are something you can decide. Like I know people who have taken a lower salary in exchange for being allowed to keep their copyrights. Like that's a thing that people negotiate about. And I think that's totally a reasonable negotiation because obviously the copyrights have some financial value. So on that sort of is to your second question. To your first question about liability. So I would recommend if you are a copyright holder and you are considering an action, don't just take my word for something, get your own lawyer and talk to your own lawyer about what your liability is. That's not a question we can answer for you. For the copyrights that are assigned to us, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give legal advice, but my understanding is that if SFC were to act on those copyrights, you could be subpoenaed as the author of the software, i.e., did you really write this? Is this really your work? All those sorts of questions. Did you have a legitimate copyright interest that you were able to assign to Conservancy? But if you were to assign to SFC, we would be the plaintiff for those copyrights, and you wouldn't be in the lawsuit you would be a witness to the lawsuit, if that makes sense. So you could get subpoenaed as a witness, but not as a litigant. Now, that's my non-legal understanding. I think that you should always seek out legal advice before you make legal decisions. And if you need a reference to a lawyer who's not our lawyer, i.e. you want a separate lawyer, I have a list of lawyers that do not do work for us that you could talk to. And they may even do it pro bono, maybe. At least low bono, cheaper rates when they know you're an open source developer. So if that's a question that you have, definitely talk to a lawyer and don't take my word for it because I have an interest, right? I would like to see you assigned to Conservancy. I would like to be able to say it's going to be so much better for you if you assign to SFC and we do the enforcement, right? That's my biased view. But you should seek out your own advice about those questions too. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, and awkwardly, I think what I'm going to say now, this is lovely, and thank you for being here, but I think we sort of have an obligation to wrap this at this point. But we did this on purpose before the lunch break because I knew this would be very interesting. And so ideally you'll be around and people can have these conversations and go further, but I think we should wrap now.
Okay, I'm glad to do that. And I wasn't keeping track of time, and thank you for calling time. For the people in the stream, feel free to email us at SFC. I'm B. Kuhn at SF Conservancy. You can write to compliance at SF Conservancy, which is the general contact address. So for those on the stream who'd like to get in touch, do that way, and I'll be around to talk with anybody here. And thank you for your time and putting up with a licensing talk. I really appreciate it.